Imagine playing a game where the harder you try to follow the rules, the higher your mathematical probability of ending up in divorce court.
Right. It sounds completely counterintuitive.
Totally, because we're constantly handed this cultural diagnostic manual. You know, the one that tells us exactly how relationships in modern institutions are supposed to work? Like, you have to be the perfectly egalitarian partner, the sensitive, modern 50-50 provider.
Yeah, the modern ideal, basically.
Exactly. But then you look at the actual outcomes around us, the skyrocketing isolation, the cratering marriage rates, the hostility between men and women, and you just have to ask, is the manual broken?
Well, today we are opening a completely different diagnostic manual, one that essentially claims the very foundation of our modern society is biologically and mathematically rigged against reality.
Yeah, it's a wild perspective. And if you are listening right now and you follow the debates within men's rights spaces or you navigate the red-pilled manosphere, you have undoubtedly felt the shockwaves this specific text is making.
Oh, absolutely. It is everywhere right now.
It really is. So today's deep dive is going to be an exhaustive, ultra-long look into this highly talked about new ebook. It's called Women Are the Problem, subtitled Girls Don't Become Insufferable Old Women. It's by Conrad Riker, published in 2025.
And I mean, it is a text that pulls absolutely no punches. It is methodical, it's relentless, and it is entirely unapologetic about its premise.
Which brings us to the ground rules for our mission today. We have to set these right up front. This book is intensely polarizing. It deals directly with highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
Right. Because of that, we are stating our position explicitly right now. We are not taking sides, we are not here to validate, and we are not here to endorse the viewpoints presented by Riker.
Exactly. Our mission today, our only mission really, is to impartially report on the exact claims, the historical arguments, and the specific data sets that he uses.
Yeah, we just want you to fully understand the architecture of his argument without us putting a thumb on the scale. We want you to understand the source material itself.
We are basically treating this text as an object of rigorous study. We're looking at the mechanics, the historical parallels, and just the underlying logic of his conclusions.
And before we jump into the deep end, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the show. It really helps us keep bringing you these massive deep dives.
Definitely.
Also, if you want to read the source material yourself and see exactly what we're analyzing today, you should check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook. And you can also follow at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Okay, so to lay the groundwork here,
Right.
Riker's core thesis is just sweeping. I mean, he argues that modern institutions, so everything from university systems to family courts to corporate HR departments, have been entirely captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Right, and he argues that this ideological capture has led to this forced denial of basic biological reality.
Yeah, he literally traces a timeline from early 20th century Soviet policy straight into the algorithms of modern TikTok.
Which is quite the leap to make.
It is, but he views modern society as this mechanism that forces humans to fight their own inherent biological nature. And he says this results in the weaponization of the legal system against men, and ultimately just an epidemic of profound misery for both sexes.
So he believes we are losing a war against our own DNA, basically. Simply because our institutions demand that we pretend DNA doesn't dictate behavior.
Exactly.
So let's start right where Riker starts with this concept he calls the chivalry trap. This is really his foundational argument about cognitive dissonance.
Right, the chivalry trap. So he defines this as a modern paradox, where women demand egalitarian 50-50 authority over all decisions, but they simultaneously expect what he terms feudal-era male service.
It's like you want the modern authority, but the traditional protection. He illustrates this with a highly specific social dynamic, the expectation that a man must never assert patriarchal authority, but he still has to flawlessly perform traditional provisioning whenever it's convenient.
Yeah, and he gives this brutal, very vivid anecdote to explain it.
Oh, the tech founder story.
Yes. So there's this tech founder at a charity gala with his wife, and they were discussing their philanthropic budget for the year.
Right, and the husband suggests reallocating some of their charitable donations to a different fund.
And his wife just publicly shreds him in front of all their peers. She
Wow.
literally snaps at him to stop mansplaining their finances.
So she claims ultimate authority in that egalitarian moment, but then Riker notes what happens exactly 6 months later at tax time.
Right. 6 months later, she dumps a shoebox full of crumpled receipts on his desk and demands that he sort it out and do their taxes.
Which Riker uses to illustrate this rigged no-win scenario for modern men, because if the man attempts to lead the household, he's branded an oppressive patriarch.
Exactly. But if he steps back and fully embraces that 50-50 model, if he asks her to split the grueling labor or take the lead on a complex tax problem, then he's accused of not being a real man.
You are the villain for leading, and you are the villain for not serving. And the thing is, Riker doesn't just rely on these anecdotes, he brings in heavy data here.
Yeah, he points specifically to a 2023 Stockholm University study.
Ah, yes, the Swedish pronoun revolution. So for context, Sweden has been pushing incredibly hard for egalitarian language, like literally trying to engineer natural distinctions out of their cultural vocabulary.
Right. They introduced a gender-neutral pronoun into the official dictionary. They were attempting to just flatten the linguistic differences between men and women, operating on the assumption that language dictates reality.
But the reality apparently snapped back hard, because the study found that 44% of Swedish women are now actively complaining that the men in their society have become emotionally constipated.
Which is a fascinating phrase.
It really is. They engineered traditional masculine assertiveness out of the men, and then the women were miserable because the men lacked that traditional masculine assertiveness.
And Riker connects this directly to biology. His argument is that the more a society attempts to erase natural distinctions through state-sponsored ideology or language policing, the more human nature aggressively rebels.
So the biology doesn't just disappear, it just mutates into resentment.
Exactly. And he backs this up with data from the National Center for Health Statistics. It shows that 66% of women in completely 50-50 egalitarian marriages end up filing for divorce.
66%. That's a massive number. And he contrasts this with data showing that traditionalist couples report exponentially higher trust and long-term satisfaction.
Yeah, he uses this metaphor that really stuck with me. He describes modern egalitarian marriage as trying to have a ship with two helms during a squall.
Oh, right. He writes that ships need one helm, not a democracy in a squall.
It's a very striking visual. Like when the weather is calm, you can pretend a ship can be steered by a committee. But when the squall hits, a committee guarantees you will sink.
I do struggle with this metaphor slightly, though. I mean, is he arguing that true equality, like the idea of an equal partnership, is actually mathematically impossible? Or is he just saying that our current corporate HR department version of it is broken?
Well, he is actually making that massive claim.
Wait, really?
Yet Riker is quite explicit that true equality, defined as men and women being interchangeable parts in a social machine, is a complete myth.
Okay, so he's saying they just aren't interchangeable.
Right. He argues that men and women are complementary forces. They are fundamentally asymmetrical by biological design. So when chaos strikes, the squall in your analogy, instinct entirely trumps ideology.
Oh, he gives that fascinating example of the progressive couple in Florida, right?
Yes. This couple spent years, quote unquote, empowering their marriage through shared decision-making rubrics and weekly emotional check-ins.
Very modern, very 50-50.
Exactly. But then a Category 4 hurricane hit their home, and the wife completely froze in panic and just screamed at the husband to tell her what to do and how to save them.
And to Riker, that moment is basically biology 1, ideology 0. The veneer of equality washes away the second physical reality reasserts itself.
That's his core argument right there.
So if biology is this inescapable concrete foundation, Riker looks at how the current cultural landscape is actively trying to challenge objective reality, and he goes directly to the sports world to illustrate this clash.
Yeah, because sports serve as his ultimate proving ground for this biology over ideology thesis. You just can't abstract sports. You cannot philosophize your way out of a stopwatch or a heavyweight.
Right, it's objective. So he points to Title IX, which was legislation originally created to ensure opportunities specifically for biological females.
But now he argues that the institutional capture of sports is weaponizing Title IX. Like it's erasing the very women it was meant to protect by forcing female athletes to compete against biological males.
Males who have retained the bone density, the lung capacity, and the fast-twitch muscle fibers of male puberty. And this is where he makes a very heavy, very historical accusation.
He does. He compares modern transgender sports policies to East Germany's Olympic doping program in the 1970s.
Which is a wild comparison. So for listeners who don't know, the East German state systematically pumped their female athletes full of anabolic steroids, specifically oral turnable.
Right, and they did this without the athlete's consent to artificially build male-level muscle mass so they could just dominate the medal stands.
And Riker calls today's policies ideological doping. Like, instead of injecting steroids to mimic male physiology, modern institutions are forcing society to swallow a lie that male physiology itself doesn't confer an advantage.
Yeah, and he cites ESPN data claiming 72% of female athletes feel profoundly demoralized competing against biological males because they know the mathematical impossibility of winning.
But the thing is, Riker doesn't just see this as a debate about medals or sports. He frames this as something much more insidious.
Right, he frames it as cultural Marxism's endgame.
Which is a huge jump. How does he justify that?
Well, Riker argues that the goal isn't just about inclusion in sports. The goal is destroying the concept of objective reality so that society can be reshaped from the ground up by the state.
Oh,
Yeah, his logic is chillingly straightforward. He says if a government or an institution can force you to publicly deny the basic reality of chromosomes, if they can make you look at a biological male and force you to say it is a female, they have broken your reliance on your own senses.
so once you surrender your perception of basic physical reality to the state, you can be forced to accept absolutely anything.
Exactly.
Which naturally leads us to ask, if biology and traditional roles are inescapable and institutions are trying to force a false reality on us, how is this actually playing out for the everyday guy?
You mean just the average guy trying to navigate the dating world?
Yeah, because this ideological capture doesn't just stay in the Olympics or the HR department, it bleeds directly into our phones.
This brings us to section 2 of Riker's outline, his exploration of what he calls the sexual market value math and the hypergamy trap.
Right. So Riker argues that the modern dating market has morphed into this hyperinflated, highly transactional matrix. And he claims that women are, mathematically speaking, pricing themselves out of existence.
He illustrates this with an incredible historical comparison that really puts it in perspective. He asks the reader to picture the year 1944.
Okay, 1944. You have a U.S. Army cook making roughly $78 a month.
Right, and he walks into a stateside dance hall, and he instantly has 5 different women vying for his attention.
Because they're looking to build a future, start a family, and they just see a competent, stable man.
Exactly. But fast forward to today. You have a highly educated data analyst making $120,000 a year, and he is just drowning in absolute silence on dating apps.
He is virtually invisible.
Yeah, so Riker asks, what happened to the currency of the dating market?
And Riker argues the currency became artificially hyperinflated by what he terms main character inflation, which is driven entirely by social media algorithms.
Right, and he brings in a 2024 Bumble study that is incredibly revealing regarding this inflation. The study found that 63% of female users on the app explicitly demand partners who earn over $500,000 a year.
Over $500,000. I mean, they're literally swiping left on anyone making less than the top 1% of the 1%.
Exactly. But the crushing reality of the math is that only 7% of those same women clear $200,000 themselves.
So the expectations are completely decoupled from reality.
Completely. Riker argues that hypergamy, which is the recognized biological instinct for women to seek partners of equal or higher status to ensure security, well, that instinct has been utterly hijacked and short-circuited by Instagram and corporate feminism.
Because Instagram creates a false perception of what the average lifestyle even is. You see private jets and Dubai vacations all day, and suddenly the guy making $120,000 looks like a peasant.
That is exactly the matrix Riker is describing. Women are chasing a microscopic fraction of top-tier men based on corporate titles, height, and digital clout.
Meanwhile, they're entirely ignoring perfectly good, solid men who offer actual commitment and stability.
And the tragedy, according to Riker, is that they do this while their own biological fertility windows are rapidly closing.
He actually uses Tudor history to back this up, which I found fascinating. He brings up the rivalry between Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon in 1527.
Yeah, it's a great historical parallel.
Right. So for listeners who don't know the deep history, Catherine of Aragon had a 24-year marriage to King Henry VIII. It was this marriage built on immense political alliances, international treaties, and just decades of relational equity.
But then Anne Boleyn comes along.
Right, and she leverages pure sexual chemistry. She withholds intimacy to drive Henry crazy and uses fleeting passion to literally dethrone Catherine.
And Riker points out that Anne Boleyn miscalculated terribly. She traded on a depreciating asset, which was novelty and sexual tension.
Because once she was queen, the novelty faded. She couldn't produce a male heir, and without the deep relational equity that Catherine had built, she was just utterly discarded. I mean, she literally lost her head.
Exactly. And Riker says modern women are making the exact same error on a mass scale today. They are trading the potential for lasting relational equity, building a life with a good man over decades, for fleeting validation from top-tier men on Tinder who will never actually commit to them.
And the statistics really do bear out his premise here. He notes that Pew Research shows 72% of women under 35 are stuck in what are now called situationships.
Right, they are orbiting high-status men, just waiting for a guy to commit, which he rarely does because his options are virtually limitless.
So Riker's diagnosis is that modern women are starving to death in a buffet of options because they've priced themselves as a luxury asset that no one is actually interested in buying for the long term.
But Riker doesn't just diagnose the math here. He offers very specific prescriptions for how to operate within it.
Yeah, he has solutions for both sides. For women, he suggests a protocol he calls the B- strategy.
I have to explain this because it sounds insulting on its face, but his logic is very methodical.
Yeah, what exactly is the B- strategy?
So it's his advice for women to intentionally drop their physical looks threshold for men by exactly 20%, and instead use that freed up bandwidth to screen ruthlessly for character markers.
Okay, so things like integrity, loyalty, and intrinsic drive.
Right, because he cites data from the Wall Street Journal showing that men labeled with the job title quote-unquote lawyer on dating apps get 15 times more matches than identical profiles featuring the exact same photos but without the prestigious title.
Wow, 15 times. So Riker is basically telling women to stop treating a man's face or his corporate job title like a collectible item to show off to their friends, and to focus on the foundation of the man's character instead.
And for the men navigating this inflated market, he has a totally different protocol. He introduces this concept called compound charisma.
Because Riker is deeply critical of the modern self-help idea that men need to be abstractly perfect, or that they have to become millionaires overnight to be worthy of love.
Right, instead he applies James Clear's famous 1% daily improvement formula from the book Atomic Habits directly to relationship capital and male value.
Yeah, he details a case study of a former incel client. This client was deeply depressed, totally invisible to women, and overwhelmed by the perceived impossibility of competing.
But Riker didn't tell him to go get rich. He had him add just 15 minutes of posture drills and conversational joke memorization to his morning routine. Just micro improvements.
So the idea is that a 15-minute daily investment compounds over time.
Exactly. Riker claims it yields a 37x annual return on investment in what he calls the man's sexual market value.
Because masculine psychology and societal value reward demonstrated practical competence, not abstract potential.
Yeah, so Riker advocates for things like cold showers at dawn, lifting weights, and building what he calls a micro dowry of practical abilities.
Like fixing a carburetor, building a fire, or just commanding a room with good posture. But this is where I really have to step in and look at the underlying philosophy of this advice.
Oh, you mean the Wall Street jargon?
Yes, exactly. I understand the practicality of his advice, but Riker treats dating entirely like a stock market. He's constantly using terminology like ROI, market value math, shorting vanity, going long on loyalty, auditing your relational ledger.
It's very heavily financialized language.
Right. So my question is, doesn't reducing human connection and romantic love to a literal balance sheet risk creating the exact same transactional, sterile coldness that he accuses corporate feminism of creating in the first place?
That is a very fair point.
Isn't he just replacing HR jargon with Wall Street finance jargon?
I'd argue that is perhaps the most significant philosophical tension within Riker's entire framework. Because on one hand, later in the book, he passionately advocates for a return to deeply spiritual, traditional marriage covenants built on unconditional loyalty.
Right, he wants the spiritual union.
But on the other hand, his diagnostic tools for finding that marriage are hyper-capitalist, cold, and entirely transactional.
It seems like a huge contradiction.
Well, Riker's defense, if we read between the lines, is that he is simply describing the battlefield exactly as it currently exists. He seems to believe that before you could afford the luxury of building a spiritual union, you must first survive the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of the modern mating market.
So you cannot transcend the matrix until you understand its code.
Exactly.
Okay, so to understand why the dating market became this transactional matrix in the first place, Riker says we have to trace the timeline backward. We need to look at how our foundational institutions were historically captured and reprogrammed.
Yes. And if you are a listener who studies the history of political movements, Riker's mapping here is going to be wildly interesting.
It is arguably the most provocative and historically dense section of the text.
Because Riker makes the explicit, heavily cited claim that early feminism was not a grassroots organic movement for equal rights. He says it was inextricably linked from its inception to Marxist subversion, specifically engineered to destroy the nuclear family.
Which is a huge claim. And he goes straight into the historical archives for this. He brings up Emmeline Pankhurst, the highly famous British suffragette.
Right. Today, she is universally remembered in history books as this heroic champion of women's voting rights.
But Riker points out a massive historical footnote that gets glossed over. In 1917, Pankhurst wired Vladimir Lenin to enthusiastically congratulate him on the Bolsheviks overthrowing the Tsar.
She explicitly called Bolshevism the quote-unquote natural ally of women's emancipation.
And Riker asserts that modern, sanitized histories of the feminist movement intentionally omit these connections. He wants the reader to recognize the shared DNA between modern progressive gender rallies and the hammer and sickle.
Yeah, and he reinforces this by taking a deep dive into the 1920s Soviet Union, specifically analyzing a state program called the Zenodal.
I have to be honest, reading about the Zenodal was staggering. I had actually never heard of it.
Most people haven't.
So for our audience, the Zenodal was the women's department of the Secretariat of the Central Committee of the All-Russian Communist Party, established by Lenin. But it wasn't just some bureaucracy advocating for equal pay or state-sponsored daycare.
Oh, far from it. Riker details how the Zenodal functioned day to day. Its primary operational goal was the complete dissolution of the private family unit, which Marxists viewed as the ultimate capitalist structure.
Right. They literally implemented policies to rip children from their homes at age 3 for mandatory state indoctrination.
They were severing the bond between mother and child to replace it with a bond between citizen and state.
And the USSR's first female minister, a woman named Alexandra Kollontai, was the ideological architect of all this. She famously declared that motherhood was merely, quote-unquote, a biological accident.
Yes, she argued the family was a selfish, bourgeois institution that needed to be completely eradicated.
And Riker's entire point in bringing up this history is to argue that this exact same rhetoric, the framing of motherhood as a burden, the framing of the traditional family as oppressive, is the exact script being used today by modern institutions.
Right. He argues that modern radicals aren't inventing new ideas. They are simply recycling failed Soviet policies and rebranding them with much better corporate PR.
And he relies heavily on the writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the famous Soviet dissident, to explain the strategy here. Solzhenitsyn wrote that communists specifically targeted women first because women are society's emotional and social core.
Exactly. If you can capture the minds of the women, you capture the next generation, and ultimately you capture the civilization.
So Riker links this historical Marxist intent directly to modern economic behavior. He brings in a 2023 Stanford study showing that modern women are 23% more likely than men to support heavy wealth redistribution schemes and expanded state welfare.
And according to Riker's framework, this isn't a coincidence at all. It is the direct result of institutions bypassing logic and targeting a woman's innate biological desire for security.
Right, because in the traditional model, a husband is the provider and protector. But if an ideology can convince a woman that she is inherently oppressed by the quote-unquote patriarchy and that her husband is her oppressor, she will naturally turn to a new protector.
The state effectively replaces the husband. The government and the corporate HR department become the ultimate, unchallengeable providers.
The state provides the ultimate safety net, requiring absolute ideological compliance in return.
Precisely.
And to hammer this point home, Riker draws an incredible contrast between competence and manufactured grievance.
Yes, on one side of the ledger, he looks at the modern gender studies degree.
Oh, this story was tragicomic. He tells the story of a Portland muralist who racked up $40,000 in student loan debt for a degree in gender studies.
Right, and she ended up unemployed, living in an apartment paid for entirely by her brother.
Who was a union roofer working massive hours.
Yep. Exactly. And she spent her days berating him as a quote-unquote patriarchal oppressor while living on his dime.
So Riker uses her as the avatar of the grievance economy, a system that produces absolutely no tangible value, creates immense debt, and sustains itself entirely by manufacturing conflict.
But then you contrast this with the other side of Riker's ledger, the 19th century British housewives.
This blew my mind. Riker details how these 19th century Victorian housewives formed private investment clubs. I mean, they didn't have the right to vote. They operated entirely within the domestic sphere, but they pooled their household allowances and started trading stocks and bonds.
And the kicker is they actually averaged 3% higher annual returns than professional male brokers working in London at the time.
Because they achieved this by operating outside the ego-driven panic of the trading floor. They used tea, crumpets, and absolute cold-blooded, zero-emotion decision-making to build actual generational wealth.
Riker's overarching point here is that the free market inevitably rewards those who solve real problems and demonstrate competence,
Yeah.
not those who merely manufacture grievances.
So he actively advocates for women to abandon corporate feminism and return to what he calls trad femme finance.
Which he vividly describes as baking sourdough in the kitchen while shorting the S&P 500 on your laptop.
It's this wild synthesis of traditional domesticity and ruthless financial competence.
So if we trace Riker's logic here, he is asserting that the modern corporate HR department, the university Title IX office, and the gender studies classroom are the direct functional successors of the Soviet Politburo.
They are laundering anti-family Marxist ideology through polite corporate jargon to ensure total state dependency.
Right. But the obvious question is, if these institutions have successfully reprogrammed the ideology of the workplace and the university, how do they handle the men who just refuse to comply?
Right, because ideology is just words until it has a mechanism of force. And Riker argues those teeth are found in the family court system.
This brings us to Section 4. Riker's ferocious critique of the legal battlefield, family courts, and what he defines as the shame economy.
Yeah, if you want to understand how the ideological capture is physically enforced, Riker says you have to look at the gavel. This part of the book reads like a financial thriller mixed with a dystopian nightmare.
It really does. He focuses heavily on something called the Duluth model.
So for listeners who aren't familiar, the Duluth model is a paradigm of domestic violence intervention that was developed in Duluth, Minnesota in the 1980s. And it has since been adopted by police departments and courts all over the world.
And Riker argues that the Duluth model is the purest application of Marxist conflict theory applied directly to the legal system.
Because conflict theory views all human interactions as a zero-sum power struggle between an oppressor class and an oppressed class.
Exactly. So the Duluth model automatically codifies men as the inherent oppressors and women as the inherent victims in literally any domestic dispute.
So practically speaking, this means if the police are called to a domestic disturbance, the foundational training of the Duluth model dictates that the male is presumed the aggressor by default, regardless of who initiated the conflict.
Right. And Riker argues this has created a completely rigged system of gynocentric due process, where male guilt is mathematically presumed before evidence is even gathered.
And he reinforces this by examining the broader cultural weaponization of victimhood in public spaces. He focuses heavily on the Karen phenomenon.
Yeah, we've all seen the viral videos. A woman in a park or a coffee shop calling the police on a man, often a minority man, or just a guy existing in her vicinity, for incredibly mundane, non-criminal things.
But Riker doesn't just look at this as bad behavior. He frames it deeply through Carl Jung's psychology, specifically the concept of shadow projection.
Right, so in Jungian psychology, the shadow consists of the repressed, deeply insecure, or negative aspects of the unconscious mind.
So when a person cannot handle their own internal darkness or misery, their ego protects itself by projecting those exact flaws onto someone else.
Exactly. And Riker cites a staggering statistic that 72% of false public disturbance reports in New York City are filed by women.
Wow. And Riker compares these modern Karens directly to the spinsters of the Salem witch trials. In Salem, women accused their neighbors of witchcraft to mask their own internal misery and gain social power.
And today, Riker says, miserable modern women pathologize normal male behavior, normal male joy, or just a man occupying space. They weaponize the police or park rangers to inflict their internal psychological distress onto the external world.
And this weaponization has sparked a literal technological arms race.
Oh yes, the dad cam movement.
Right. Riker profiles this massive underground network of 230,000 fathers on TikTok and private forums who literally wear hidden body cameras in public, or whenever they're interacting with their ex-partners during custody handoffs.
They do this to prevent false accusations because, as Riker succinctly puts it, footage doesn't lie, but family court judges do.
But the body cameras are just the surface level of this arms race. Riker delves into a concept he calls judicial Darwinism.
Yeah, his thesis is that the family court system does not just target masculinity, it actively exploits male compliance.
If a man plays by the rules of a game that has been rigged by the Duluth model and gynocentric due process, he will be financially and emotionally destroyed.
Therefore, the only evolutionary response is extreme non-compliance.
He advises men to stop treating modern marriage as a sacred sacrament and to start treating it defensively like a hostile corporate merger. And the examples he gives of men executing this non-compliance are wild.
Oh, the Chicago ER nurse.
Yes. He tells the story of this Chicago ER nurse who gets served divorce papers completely out of the blue. And instead of going to counseling or hiring a standard lawyer to negotiate away half his pension, the nurse liquidates $82,000 of his savings into Monero.
And Monero is absolutely crucial to this story.
Right, for those who don't know the mechanics of crypto, Bitcoin is traceable. Every transaction is on a public ledger. If you buy Bitcoin, a forensic accountant in a divorce court can track it.
But Monero is different. It uses ring signatures and stealth addresses to completely obfuscate the sender, the receiver, and the amount. It is a cryptographic black box.
So the nurse liquidated his wealth into Monero, put the cryptographic keys on a cold storage hardware wallet, and essentially challenged his wife's lawyers to find it.
Which Riker calls applied stoicism. Just physically removing your assets from a system you cannot control.
And this financial insurgency scales up into what Riker calls the van life brotherhood.
Right, these are entire networks of men who have completely unplugged their wealth and their labor from the traditional banking system.
They use things like DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations based in Panama. Now, a DAO is essentially a corporation run by smart contracts on a blockchain instead of a CEO or a board of directors.
And these men are funneling their freelance income into these Panamanian DAOs while simultaneously hiding physical gold bullion in private, non-bank vaults near the Mexican border, just to shield their assets from family court subpoenas.
I mean, they are turning themselves into financial ghosts.
And Riker is unequivocally validating this. He argues that when a state system weaponizes the concept of fairness merely to extract wealth from men, a man must either adapt his strategy or be completely drained.
So he views decentralized, offshore financial insurgency as the only logical survival tactic against a predatory, gynocratic machine. But wait, I have to ask, he's basically advising men to become financial ghosts. It's a literal arms race.
Yeah, he is saying the system is so broken that it's the only rational response left.
Okay, so the family courts are the physical financial trap. You can try to hide your money in a DAO or in gold, but Riker argues that the psychological trap is much harder to escape because it is enforced digitally right in our pockets 24 hours a day through the algorithms on our phones.
Which brings us to Section 5, algorithmic warfare, and a concept he brilliantly coins as the simpularity.
The simpularity.
Yes. Riker posits that social media algorithms are not neutral platforms for sharing photos. They are highly sophisticated psychological weapons actively designed to monetize male isolation on one side and female outrage on the other.
So let's look at the mechanics of the female outrage side first. He describes the TikTok algorithm as a digital catabasis.
Catabasis is an ancient Greek literary term for a hero's descent into the underworld, like Orpheus going down into Hades.
Right. So Riker says these apps intentionally drag users down into the basement of their own unprocessed trauma. He gives this terrifying example of a Minnesota mother who abruptly filed for divorce, claiming her husband was holding doors open for her, quote unquote, too aggressively, framing it as a microaggression.
And when digital forensic analysts looked at her TikTok algorithm history, they found she had been fed and had completely watched 87 consecutive videos under the hashtag divorce him.
Just videos detailing hyper-niche, pathologized complaints about husbands.
Exactly. Riker points to SEMrush data showing that Instagram search volume for the phrase toxic masculinity tripled overnight in 2021. And this was directly following a back-end algorithm update designed to push controversial content.
The platforms are literally feeding division because outrage generates immense, sustained engagement, and engagement generates ad revenue.
Yes, and to explain the psychological toll this takes on women, Riker brings Carl Jung back into the mix, discussing something he calls the animus integration score.
This requires a bit of a deep dive into Jungian theory, right?
Yeah, so Jung proposed that every woman has an unconscious masculine inner personality called the animus, just as men have an inner feminine anima.
And a healthy psychology requires a woman to integrate her animus. Like she needs to internalize that masculine energy to build her own internal strength, logic, and assertiveness.
But Riker argues that modern feminism and TikTok algorithms actively prevent this integration. They encourage women to externalize that masculine energy and project it outward as perpetual rage against men.
So they never integrate it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He argues this unintegrated masculine energy turns modern women into what he calls walking opinion mills. They burn all their biological and psychological energy, tearing down systems and fighting phantom patriarchies online.
And the tragic result, Riker notes, is that these women are left with cortisol and stress hormone levels similar to combat soldiers, which leads to chronic anxiety and rapidly declining fertility. And on the flip side of this algorithmic warfare, how are these systems targeting men? This is where we hit that concept of the singularity.
Right, and Riker draws a phenomenal historical parallel here. He compares the modern digital landscape for men to the 18th century London gin craze.
Okay, so during the gin craze, the British government deregulated distilling, and suddenly cheap, incredibly potent gin flooded the slums of London.
And the result was a catastrophic epidemic of male alcoholism. Men abandoned their families, they stopped working, and society nearly collapsed.
And the government largely ignored it for years because they were collecting massive taxes on the liquor sales.
Right. So Riker argues that the modern tech feminist complex is doing the exact same thing. But instead of cheap gin, they're dealing in cheap digital dopamine through platforms like OnlyFans, Twitch, and Tinder.
He calculates that OnlyFans and similar parasocial platforms extract $500 billion annually from isolated men. $500 billion mathematically siphoned out of the male working class.
He tells the devastating story of a 45-year-old forklift operator who blew his entire $60,000 life savings on Twitch streamers, tipping them massive amounts of money just to hear a beautiful woman read his screen name out loud on a live stream.
It's so bleak. Riker views this digital ecosystem as a virtual harem designed to pacify and neuter men.
Yes. Instead of harnessing their natural biological frustration to build real-world skills, lift weights, approach real women, and build actual families, men are having their resources and their reproductive drive siphoned off by parasocial ghosts.
And he explains the mechanism of this using B.F. Skinner's behavioral psychology. Tinder and TikTok operate exactly like a Skinner box.
Right. Skinner proved that if you put a pigeon in a box and give it a food pellet every single time it pecks a button, it'll peck when it's hungry and then just stop.
But if you give it a pellet on a variable ratio schedule, meaning the reward is completely randomized and unpredictable, the pigeon will peck the button obsessively until it literally dies of exhaustion.
And Riker points out that Tinder and Bumble explicitly hide 80% of male profiles. They engineer a variable ratio schedule of rejection and rare validation to keep men hungry, desperate, and endlessly paying for premium subscriptions.
It is a psychological protection racket. The algorithms are Skinner boxes designed by Silicon Valley to keep men starved and docile and women angry and isolated. Also, tech companies can extract maximum wealth.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of the text. If the entire system, the courts, the apps, the universities, is a rigged matrix designed to extract wealth and destroy the family, what is Riker's exact protocol for men to unplug?
And this is where Riker delivers his final and undoubtedly most aggressive set of prescriptions. His solution is a hardline, uncompromising rejection of the modern world.
Yes, Section 6. He demands that men practice a protocol he calls radical austerity.
So radical austerity begins with a ruthless 90-day detox. Zero pornography, zero dating apps, absolute zero participation in parasocial relationships on Twitch, Instagram, or OnlyFans.
He wants men to surgically reclaim the 3 or 4 hours a day they currently waste swiping and simping. And he models this austerity on elite high performers.
He points to Elon Musk, right, who famously divides his entire day into 5-minute time blocks to squeeze maximum output from every waking moment.
Yes, and he also heavily leans on the neurobiology popularized by the Huberman Lab. Riker cites data showing that early morning cold plunges, literally immersing yourself in freezing water, spikes baseline dopamine levels by 250% and sustains that elevation for hours.
So he demands men use this biological momentum to build their lives, entirely bypassing the need for cheap digital validation. You just generate your own neurochemical drive.
And Riker looks internationally for examples of this rejection taking hold on a macro scale. He points to the South Korean soy strike.
Right, this is essentially the male equivalent of the South Korean 4B movement, where women opted out of dating.
Exactly. In the soy strike, massive cohorts of young South Korean men feeling entirely crushed by a hyper-competitive, feminist-leaning corporate state that they feel just hates them are simply checking out.
They are refusing to marry, refusing to participate in the corporate grind, refusing to buy luxury goods to impress women. They are living minimalist lives, playing video games, and starving the system of their labor and tax dollars.
And when the South Korean government panicked over the collapsing birth rate and literally mailed young men marriage encouragement coupons to try and bribe them back into the system, the men filmed themselves using the coupons as toilet paper.
Wow, so Riker sees the soy strike as the necessary beginning of a global male rebellion, but he doesn't want men to just check out and play video games.
No, he wants to channel that exact energy into building what he calls parallel institutions.
Here is where it gets really interesting. He is actively advocating for men to stop arguing with feminists on Twitter, delete their accounts, and instead form localized men's sheds, decentralized crypto networks, and physical trade collectives.
Basically, build your own economy. But Riker doesn't abandon the concept of family, he just wants to rebuild it outside the system.
Right, for the men and women who do want to build a life together, he introduces some incredibly traditional, almost ancient frameworks. He talks about concepts like womb productivity and the servant queen challenge.
Now, these concepts are guaranteed to be highly controversial within modern progressive contexts, but they are deeply rooted in historical traditionalism.
Yeah, he cites a study from the National Marriage Project showing that spouses who actively and intentionally practice acts of service to one another experience an 89% higher rate of marital satisfaction.
So, the Servant Queen Challenge, he challenges women to wake up daily and ask exactly how they can strengthen their man's mission.
He could be mending a jacket, bringing him coffee while he works, or managing the household logistics. Acts of humble traditional service that Riker claims build an impenetrable biological loyalty from the man in return.
And he pushes this even further with a concept he calls the Third Covenant. Riker argues that a two-legged stool will inevitably wobble and fall over, but a three-legged stool stands firm regardless of the pressure.
So he believes a modern marriage, based solely on the two legs of romantic love and 50-50 equity, will collapse under the stress of the modern world. A marriage needs a third entity to survive.
Right. God, a shared Orthodox faith, or a profound generational legacy project.
And he backs this up with data noting that couples who actively pray together daily face only a 1% chance of divorce. 1%.
That's incredibly low. He advises couples to completely abandon modern therapy check-ins, which he views as narcissistic and destructive.
Instead, he tells them to adopt ancient rituals, lighting a candle and reciting compline prayers together at night, physically surrendering their individual egos to something older, wiser, and larger than themselves.
The overarching theme that ties all of Riker's final prescriptions together is legacy over likes. He is desperately trying to convince men and women to elevate physical, tangible legacy over digital clout.
He points out the absurdity of modern priorities. You will never, ever walk into a museum in 100 years and see a top 1% OnlyFans creator plaque preserved in glass. It is ephemeral garbage.
What you see in museums are hand-carved wooden cribs, wartime letters between devoted spouses, and generational family crests.
He tells men to focus on having children, sewing heirloom quilts, and teaching a grandson how to navigate by the stars and hunt his own food.
Riker ultimately views rigorous physical discipline, decentralized finance, and traditional religion not just as self-help practices, but as the actual necessary operating system required for civilization to survive the coming collapse.
It's almost a monastic retreat from modern society, just with heavy lifting and crypto. It is a complete architectural blueprint for opting out of the mainstream matrix.
It is. Which leaves us with a profound, almost unavoidable question to consider as we close this analysis.
What's that?
Well, if Riker's historical analysis is correct, that institutions inherently cycle between ideological capture, totalitarian overreach, and eventual collapse, what happens when this parallel economy of traditionalist, unplugged men and women gets large enough?
Does it simply quietly replace the old system as the mainstream crumbles under its own weight? Or do the two systems eventually have to violently collide? That is a fascinating and honestly a slightly terrifying thought to mull over. If the ship has two helms and is heading directly into a squall, maybe the only logical answer isn't to fight over the wheel, but to build a completely different ship.
And that, at its core, is exactly the challenge Riker is throwing down to his readers.
What an incredible deep dive. To you, our listeners, we hope this impartial breakdown of the mechanics, the deep history, and the psychological data within Riker's arguments has given you a much clearer lens through which to view these ongoing cultural debates.
Absolutely. The diagnostic manual of modern society might be mathematically rigged, but by unpacking the underlying code, we can start to see exactly how the machine operates.
Well said. Before we go, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the show. And if you want to inspect the source material yourself and dive into the exact data we discussed today, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy Conrad Riker's ebook, Women Are the Problem.
It's definitely worth reading to see the full scope of his argument.
Also be sure to follow @Conrad Riker on Substack for more of his daily writings and protocols. Until next time, keep diving deep.